Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to travel back to a forgotten chapter in military history. A campaign so strange, so seemingly absurd, that it almost sounds like fiction. But it's not. It really happened. And it's one of the few wars in modern history where humans, armed with machines of war, found themselves utterly outmaneuvered by birds. Imagine this. An arid, sun-drenched landscape. Endless red dirt plains stretch toward a wavering horizon. The scent of dry grass and eucalyptus drifts in the wind. It's 1932, and the Great Depression has carved deep grooves into the Australian economy. Farmers, mostly veterans of the First World War, struggle to coax wheat from the stubborn land. And just when things seemed at their lowest, a new enemy arrived. Feathered, flightless, fast, and fearless. Emus, not just a few, tens of thousands. The stage for this most unusual war was Western Australia. Specifically, the Campion District, a stretch of land where settlers had been granted farms as part of a post-war soldier resettlement scheme. These men, many of whom still bore physical and emotional scars from Gallipoli, Fromelles, and the Western Front, now found themselves fighting a new kind of battle, one that no one could have prepared them for. But let's slow down for a moment. To understand why the Emu War happened, we need to first understand the land, the people, and the strange intersection of policy, poverty, and poultry that brought everything together in such a bizarre fashion. Western Australia in the early 1930s was a hard land. The soil was tough. The climate was harsher still. Rainfall came when it wanted or not at all. The wind was often dry and biting, cutting through wool coats and swirling dust across the horizon. Farmers lived in modest homesteads, wooden structures with tin roofs that clanged and groaned in the heat. Their daily meals were simple: salted mutton, damper bread cooked over a wood stove, and billy tea brewed black and strong. Entertainment, when there was time, consisted of reading dog-eared newspapers, playing cards under flickering oil lamps, or listening to battered gramophones that spun dance tunes from another world. But beneath the routines of farm life, there was struggle. Wheat prices had collapsed. The government offered little support. Machinery broke down often and parts were hard to come by. Many farmers had to rely on their own ingenuity, fixing things with twine, repurposing tools, or simply doing without. And then, in that hot and unforgiving November of 1932, the emus came. They moved like a tide, a shaggy, feathered wave, surging in from the interior. Driven from inland areas by drought and hunger, these great birds, standing nearly 6 feet tall, with powerful legs and wary yellow eyes, arrived in massive flocks. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands. The farmers watched with disbelief as the emus flooded their fields. The birds were quick, too quick. They tore through the crops with little regard, pecking, trampling, and nesting. Fences were no match. Shotgun blasts did little to deter them. One farmer later described the birds as organized, moving like infantry columns, scattering when fired upon, regrouping again moments later. It would have been comical had it not been devastating. Some farmers tried scarecrows, others used tin pans strung on wire to make noise. Nothing worked. The emus simply returned, often under cover of dusk, their dark shapes visible against the fading sky, gliding across the stubbled fields like ghosts of war. And so, exasperated, the farmers turned to the government. And the government listened. You have to remember, these weren't just any farmers. Many were veterans. They knew the Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce. They knew how to phrase things in a way that stirred patriotic duty. "We are under siege," they said. "We need help." They spoke of their service, of sacrifice, and of how the nation had promised them land, but not an invasion of birds. And so Pearce, sympathetic and perhaps eager for a distraction from political unrest in Canberra, agreed to a most unusual request: military assistance, not supplies, not fencing material, not subsidies, but soldiers, with machine guns, and not just any soldiers. Major GPW Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was tasked with the mission. Along with 2 men from the 7th Heavy Battery and 2 Lewis guns, standard-issue British light machine guns from the Great War, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, he was dispatched to the front lines of what would become known as the Great Emu War. And while the official tone of the mission was one of support and assistance, there was also a strange air of excitement about it. Newspaper reporters tagged along. Locals gathered to watch the operations, treating them as spectacles. And the soldiers, in their khaki uniforms and heavy boots, stood tall beside their equipment, ready to face what, on paper, seemed like a most manageable enemy. But the emus were not what they seemed. Within days of arrival, the soldiers found themselves outwitted at every turn. The birds were fast, faster than anticipated. They moved in scattered formations, disappearing into brush and scrub when approached. The terrain was rough, making transport of the heavy Lewis guns difficult. When fired, the guns jammed. When aimed, the emus dodged. When surrounded, they simply ran in separate directions, making targeting impossible. On one occasion, the soldiers set up an ambush near a dam where emus had been spotted drinking. They waited patiently. A group of birds approached. The machine gunner opened fire, and the gun jammed on the second shot. The birds scattered, unharmed. Major Meredith, a man not easily rattled, later remarked that the emus displayed remarkable evasion tactics, more elusive than enemy infantry he'd faced in France. By the end of the first week, it was clear this was no ordinary engagement. The emus were not only surviving, they were winning. And so, what had begun as a straightforward operation quickly devolved into a slow, frustrating, and at times farcical campaign. Ammunition was used with little result. Vehicles broke down in the heat. Morale began to falter. But the mission, absurd as it seemed, continued, because the farmers were desperate, and the birds, well, they were everywhere. In the distance, the red horizon shimmered. The wind carried with it the sound of rustling feathers. At night, the soldiers could hear them moving, not close but not far either, pacing just beyond the tree line as if waiting. The war was only beginning, and it would get stranger from here. The mornings in the Western Australian outback began not with alarm clocks, but with a slow orange glow that crept up the walls of the tin-roofed homesteads, painting everything gold for just a moment before the heat began its relentless rise. In the nearby fields, where wheat once stood proud and tall, only patches of trampled stalks remained, broken and flat like crushed grass after a stampede. The emus had come through the night again, silent and tireless, leaving behind patterns that looked almost deliberate, as if nature itself had drawn them. For the soldiers, the routine was grimmer than expected. The early optimism, with its promise of quick victory, had faded beneath the weight of constant failure. Every morning they awoke, drank strong tea that tasted of tin, and checked the Lewis guns, oiling the mechanisms, clearing out dust, adjusting sights that never seemed to matter in the end. They'd eat whatever was available, usually salt beef and stale biscuits from army stores, and then begin the long, bone-rattling journey across the uneven tracks in their transport vehicle, which broke down so often it was more familiar with the mechanic's hands than with the road. And always they were looking for birds. The emus, by contrast, seemed to appear and vanish with uncanny precision. It was never clear where they were coming from, nor how they seemed to learn the soldiers' movements. Some farmers began to swear that the birds were watching them, observing from the ridges in small groups, motionless except for the occasional blink of a yellow eye. They came in flocks, sometimes numbering hundreds, but never stayed in one place long. They would descend on a field, tearing through the crops with their hooked beaks and long, muscular legs, and then vanish again into the low scrub and shadows, leaving only claw prints and silence behind. There were attempts at coordination. The soldiers tried forming firing lines, working with the farmers to herd the birds toward open spaces where the guns could be brought to bear. But the emus refused to cooperate. The moment they sensed danger, and it was never clear how they knew, they split into smaller units and sprinted off in different directions. It was said they could run at speeds over 30 miles per hour, and even the hardiest horses struggled to keep up. Their feathers absorbed bullets or deflected them at odd angles. It was like trying to fight the wind with bullets. By mid-November, frustration had turned to resignation. The official reports painted a polite picture: engagements, retreats, limited success. But in private, the men shared a different story. They sat around campfires at night, boots kicked off, rifles propped against crates, and told tales in low voices that always ended in laughter. Not because anything was funny, but because the absurdity had begun to rot their sense of seriousness. One evening, a soldier swore he saw an emu make eye contact with him, then casually turn around and relieve itself on a sack of grain before disappearing. No one believed him, but no one doubted the birds were capable of something like that either. Still, the farmers begged them to continue. For them, this wasn't theater. Every damaged field meant food they wouldn't sell, debts they couldn't pay, and families who'd eat thinner meals. Many of them were down to the basics. Boiled potatoes when they had them, tea brewed 3 times from the same leaves, flour stretched with ash to make the damper last longer. They wore patched shirts and trousers that had seen better decades. They didn't have the luxury of walking away. The soldiers did. And yet, even knowing that, the results remained grim. On one particularly memorable morning, Major Meredith decided to mount the Lewis gun on a truck. The idea was bold. Chase the emus across open ground, fire from a moving platform, and finally break their formations. But the truck's suspension was a suggestion at best, and as it bumped across the rocky plain, the gunner struggled to aim. The recoil of the gun, combined with the swaying of the vehicle, made it impossible to hit anything. The emus, once again, scattered unharmed. One of them even turned and ran alongside the truck for several yards before vanishing into the bush with what the men later called disrespectful elegance. There was no official laughter recorded that day, but the driver, years later, admitted he couldn't stop smiling for hours afterward. The press, of course, had a field day. Reporters embedded with the troops filed stories with headlines that walked a fine line between respect and ridicule. Emus outmaneuver military again, read one. Another, flightless foes continue to evade armed forces. One publication even suggested the birds be awarded medals for tactical brilliance. Meanwhile, in the cities, Australians read the reports with growing disbelief. Was this really happening? Was the government truly fighting birds and losing? Still, few in the public understood the scale of the emu incursion. From afar, it seemed laughable, but to the men in the fields, it was anything but. Day by day, the ground was being eaten alive, and with each sunrise, the feathered tide returned. And still, the emus were adapting. It wasn't just speed. They had patterns. Observers noted how the larger, stronger birds seemed to act as sentries, watching for danger while the others fed. When shots were fired, it was often these scouts that bolted first, triggering the retreat of the entire group. There was something ancient in their movements, a kind of inherited rhythm, as if these birds had always known how to survive human pursuit, even when the weapons changed. Major Meredith wrote in one of his reports that the birds showed a surprising degree of martial intelligence. It was a statement made half in jest, but only half, because this was no longer a joke. Not to him, and the emus had no intention of stopping. The sun dipped low again over the Campion district. In the fields, the last of the birds for the day disappeared into the tall brush, leaving only silence, broken by the chirp of insects and the soft creak of windmill blades turning lazily in the dry air. The soldiers packed away their weapons, rubbed the dust from their eyes, and looked toward the horizon. Tomorrow they'd try again, but no one knew how long this war would last, or whether it could even be one. The third week of the campaign began without ceremony, beneath a pale sky that refused to brighten fully, as if the sun itself had grown weary of watching the same routine play out again and again across the endless Western Australian plains. Dust hung low in the morning air, disturbed only by the occasional sweep of wind across the brush, and the rhythmic groan of the soldier's truck as it limped forward, carrying its strange cargo of men and machinery. One more attempt, one more day. By now, the soldiers had stopped counting the emus. The numbers blurred together in a kind of feathery haze, hundreds seen, dozens fired upon, barely any confirmed kills. And though reports were still being written and telegrams still sent back to Canberra, most of those on the ground had come to the same unspoken conclusion. Whatever was happening out here wasn't a war. It was something else. A slow humiliation, maybe, A quiet undoing of military logic in the face of something too wild, too ancient, too chaotic to conquer. The birds had no banners, no weapons, no generals. Yet they continued to win. At night, campfires glowed like soft lanterns between the gum trees, their light flickering across the tired faces of men who no longer spoke in terms of victory. The talk, when it came, was of families back east, of pubs in Fremantle, of the kind of real fights they remembered from the trenches of Europe. Fights with maps, with orders, with a visible enemy and an understandable objective. Here, the objective changed with the wind, and the enemy vanished when you blinked. Major Meredith had stopped making speeches. Once, during the first week, he had stood tall beside the mounted Lewis gun and spoken about discipline, about coordination, about efficiency and engagement. But now, he simply rubbed at his temples and stared across the horizon, where dark shapes danced in the heat shimmer. Maybe birds, maybe just illusions. No one could tell anymore. The emus had begun to shift their behavior again. Instead of moving in large flocks, they now traveled in loosely coordinated bands. 20 here, 30 there, never too close, never too far. Enough to confuse the men and make targeting nearly impossible. Each group moved with a strange synchronicity, never staying in one area long enough for an ambush to be set, yet always managing to do damage before vanishing once again into the landscape. The farmers swore the birds were smarter than they let on. Smarter, even, than some of the sheepdogs they kept around the property. It was said that if you cornered them once, they would never fall for the same trick again. In the towns, whispers of failure began to circulate. Not loudly, not in the open, but quietly, in the way pub conversations shift when a stranger enters the room. People spoke of the army's presence with a mixture of amusement and pity. Fighting birds, someone would mutter, glass in hand. What a time to be alive. And then the conversation would turn, as if no one wanted to dwell too long on the absurdity. Because if this was real, if the Commonwealth really had no answer for a bunch of overgrown birds, then what hope was there for anything else? But still, the farmers pleaded. They wrote letters, telegrams, requests. They asked for more men, more ammunition, more effort. Their crops were being obliterated. Their patience had already worn through. Some had taken to patrolling their own fields at night, shotgun in hand, walking slowly between the rows of ruined wheat in the hope of catching just one or two emus unaware. It was dangerous work. There were accidents. One farmer mistook his own dog for an emu and nearly shot it. Another fired blindly into the night and struck the corner of his neighbor's shed. But they kept going, because to stop meant surrendering the last hope of saving the season. Meanwhile, the emus began nesting. That was the newest threat. Not just roaming destruction, but permanence. Evidence of long, shallow nests began appearing at the edges of properties. Inside them, eggs, smooth and pale, nearly the size of a man's fist. The implication was clear. The birds were not just passing through. They were settling. They were making this land their own. And if something didn't change soon, there would be not thousands, but tens of thousands more in the seasons to come. A new strategy was attempted. Meredith and his men, alongside a few determined locals, began using bait, water troughs, piles of grain, anything that might lure the birds into open ground. Sometimes it worked, but more often the emus seemed to sense the trap. One farmer claimed the birds approached in single file, sent a few scouts ahead, and then turned back without touching the bait. It sounded ridiculous, but it kept happening. The Lewis guns were cleaned more often now. Not because they were working better, but because it gave the soldiers something to do, something to control. One afternoon, as the men disassembled the weapon under the sparse shade of a desert oak, a group of emus wandered within sight, just at the edge of the ridge. They didn't run. They didn't approach. They simply stood there, 20, maybe 30 of them, still as statues, their long necks rising above the grass, eyes fixed on the soldiers below. Then, without a sound, they turned and slipped away. It was starting to feel less like war and more like a game. Only no one knew the rules. And as days stretched into weeks, the question began to rise in whispers, passed between tents and campfires, carried in the space between footsteps and rifle straps. What if this can't be one? What if the emus don't lose? There's a kind of silence that settles over the bush when things go on too long without change. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, unspoken kind, where even the wind seems reluctant to stir the leaves. That was the silence that hung over the Campion district by the end of November 1932. A silence not of victory, nor of defeat, but of slow resignation. The campaign continued, but something in its tone had shifted. What had once been framed as a military operation had started to resemble a series of awkward encounters. Not battles, not skirmishes, but moments of clumsy defiance against a foe that refused to play by any recognizable rules. The men, still clothed in their olive uniforms, now stained with weeks of dust, sweat, and oil, rose each morning with fewer words and slower movements. The heat came earlier each day, and the dust lingered longer in the creases of their shirts, in the corners of their eyes, in the folds of their boots. They had long stopped writing home about the campaign. There was nothing new to say. Each day followed a rhythm they could have described in their sleep. Drive, search, aim, fire, miss, repair, repeat. Major Meredith no longer referred to the birds as the enemy. Now he simply called them them. They had become a presence, not quite natural, but not quite unnatural either. Not something to be defeated, perhaps, but something to be endured. The farmers noticed it too. They had once greeted the soldiers with cautious optimism, seeing them as a final line of defense against destruction. But as the weeks passed and the flocks remained, as fields continued to flatten and wheat failed to mature, that optimism curdled into quiet frustration. Some farmers had started leaving cracked eggs along fence posts, a subtle, grim commentary on how little had changed. Others simply stopped coming to the operations at all, choosing instead to fortify their own properties as best they could. One man, a veteran with a limp and one good eye, took to patrolling his land every evening with a lantern and a bayonet. Not to kill, but to remind himself that he was still part of something that required watching. The emus, meanwhile, seemed completely unbothered by the presence of man or machine. They moved as they always had, in loose groups, fast and unpredictable, never quite where they were expected to be. In one now infamous incident, a group of nearly 50 birds was spotted moving along a ridge near a damaged fence line. The soldiers quickly arranged a position, mounted the Lewis gun, and opened fire. But within seconds, the gun jammed. By the time it was cleared, the birds had vanished once again into the bush, leaving only a few feathers behind, drifting lazily on the hot air. That was the pattern. Over and over. A few feathers, a few broken stalks, a few stories of mischances. And so the men began keeping count in other ways. They started naming the emus, the largest among them, a hulking male with a missing patch of feathers on his right side, was nicknamed Sergeant Feather. Another, a swift and particularly evasive bird with a crooked toe, was called Dart. A smaller one, always appearing at the edge of the fields just before dusk, was quietly referred to as the Looker. None of them, of course, were ever caught, but naming them gave the soldiers something to hang on to, a sense of familiarity, of narrative, in a campaign where the only constant was failure. There were moments of surreal levity, too. One evening, as the sun dipped into the red horizon and shadows stretched across the dirt, two of the men sat carving emu silhouettes into rifle stocks. Another balanced a tin cup on the muzzle of the Lewis gun and used it as a makeshift sundial. Time had become elastic. The calendar mattered less than the heat, the wind, and the movements of the birds. Even the official reports began to lose their edge. Instead of confident numbers and tactical language, they now included phrases like limited engagement, unreliable mobility, and unexpected evasion. One memo even admitted that the emus appeared resistant to conventional suppression, a sentence that read more like an apology than a statement of fact. Canberra, still distracted by economic woes and political infighting, offered no new resources, no reinforcements, and no clear direction. The operation would continue, but only until the allotted ammunition was spent. And so, the final phase of the war crept forward, not with drama, but with inevitability. The Lewis guns rattled less often now. Not out of caution, but out of conservation. The soldiers had begun counting bullets in a way that felt almost reverent. Each round fired was one less link to the absurd promise that this war might be won. And though no one said it aloud, there was an unspoken understanding that the end was near. Not because the birds were gone, but because the men were tired. And then, just as the last case of ammunition was brought out of storage, something unexpected happened. The emus stopped moving. For 2 full days, they didn't appear at the usual spots. No fresh tracks, no disturbed fences, no distant figures on the ridgeline. The bush was silent. The sky was still. It was as if the birds had vanished all at once. The soldiers exchanged glances but said nothing. The farmers waited, rifles in hand, staring at empty fields with disbelief. And in that strange stillness, in that moment when everything seemed finally under control, someone asked the question no one wanted to answer. Was this a trick? The quiet lasted for just over 40 hours, long enough for hope to begin forming quietly and cautiously at the edges of conversation. It was spoken about only in passing, between sips of bitter tea or while mending a frayed bootlace, never quite directly, as if saying it aloud would cause the silence to break. But it was there nonetheless. Perhaps the birds had finally moved on. Perhaps the campaign, absurd as it had been, had succeeded in its own slow, clumsy way. The idea lingered like the scent of recent rain, rare, fragile, and always uncertain. On the second morning, Major Meredith stood near the truck with a folded map in one hand and the brim of his hat in the other. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. Not the hills, not the scrubland, not even the road stretching off into the pale distance. He was simply thinking. The emus hadn't been seen. The rifles hadn't been fired. Even the wind had been still, too still, as though the land itself were holding its breath. For the first time in weeks, the men didn't load the Lewis gun. They still performed their morning routine, cleaning the barrels, checking ammunition, boiling tea in dented billy cans over low fires, but it was done without urgency, without the usual weight of preparation. One soldier even unpacked a worn harmonica and played something slow and uncertain, a tune that wandered without ever quite arriving anywhere. Another sat on the truck bed carving shapes into the butt of his rifle, the movements automatic and unhurried. Breakfast that morning was better than usual. A local farmer had traded some eggs and a slab of dried kangaroo meat in exchange for help repairing a broken axle on his tractor. It wasn't much, but after weeks of hard tack, canned beans and salty rations, the change felt almost luxurious. They boiled the eggs in a dented pot, split the meat into uneven strips, and passed around the tin cups of sweetened tea as if they were fine glasses of wine. For a moment, just a brief one, it felt like the war had paused. Not ended, not won, but paused, long enough to catch a breath. But wars do not end quietly. Just before noon, a sharp whistle came from the ridge. It wasn't a bird call, not one anyone recognized, but the kind of sound that sends instinct rippling through a group before thoughts catch up. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, binoculars were raised, slowly, cautiously, as if half expecting to see nothing at all. But they were back. First just a few, a handful of dark shapes weaving between the low scrub, silhouettes half concealed in the shimmer of heat that rose from the ground. Then more, then dozens. Within minutes, the entire ridge was dotted with emus. Not in a charge, not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate migration across the land, as if nothing had changed and no bullets had ever been fired. The silence was shattered. Commands were shouted. The Lewis gun brought out of its crate with clumsy haste. The truck started with a cough of black smoke. But the birds weren't coming closer. They weren't attacking fields or tearing up fences. They were simply moving, and that, perhaps, was what made it worse. Felt like a dismissal, as if the war was still going, but the enemy had stopped acknowledging the fight. The soldiers tracked them for hours. Every time they thought they'd cornered a group, the birds scattered. Every time they fired, the results were the same: feathers, dust, and frustration. One engagement lasted nearly 15 minutes and expended more than 2 full belts of ammunition. 2 birds were confirmed hit. The rest vanished over a ridge, never to be seen again. That evening, the gunner sat with his boots off and his face in his hands, refusing food, refusing conversation. He had stopped naming the birds. Back at the field tent, Meredith drafted another report. It was shorter than usual. He no longer included the poetic justifications or hopeful conclusions. Just numbers now. Rounds fired. Hours spent. Confirmed results minimal. He folded the paper, sealed it in an envelope marked Command, Internal, and set it aside. He didn't expect a reply. He hadn't received one in over a week. That night, there was no music. The harmonica lay silent. The fire was smaller, the laughter absent. Even the crickets seemed quieter than usual. Somewhere in the dark, a group of emus moved through the underbrush, their footsteps soft and even, almost like a patrol, but not quite. And the strange thing, the thing no one said, was that the soldiers had started to admire them. Not openly, not with pride, but with a kind of reluctant respect. These birds, after all, had done something no army had. They had endured. They had adapted. And they had won, not with force, but with movement, instinct, and sheer refusal to behave. By the third week of December, the last crates of ammunition were being emptied. Every bullet now had weight, not physical but symbolic. Each one fired was a note in the closing song of a strange, dusty campaign that had lasted longer than anyone had planned, and ended in a way no one could define. And yet, there was still a question. A quiet, pulsing question that came late at night, when the wind picked up just enough to rattle the edge of the tent, and the moon cast strange shadows across the red earth. What if the emus remembered? It was in the small hours of a crisp November morning that Major Meredith and his men, still stationed near the Campion district, awoke to a familiar and unwelcome sound. The low, rhythmic thudding of hundreds of heavy feet, trampling through wheat fields under the fading stars. The emus had returned, not as scattered groups, but as one formidable mass. And this time, it seemed they had learned something. The birds moved with unusual cohesion, splitting suddenly into flanking formations, scattering when approached, regrouping just out of reach. It was as though they had developed a system, primitive perhaps, but alarmingly effective. The soldiers, fatigued and low on supplies, scrambled to their feet, grabbing rifles, kicking dust into the cool air, hearts thudding with a mix of dread and duty. They opened fire, but the emus were already dispersing. Bullets flew, but rarely found their mark. One unlucky bird tumbled forward, but another dozen darted in different directions. The machine gun jammed again, forcing the crew to disassemble it, their hands trembling, their fingers stiff with cold. One soldier swore he saw an emu glance back over its shoulder, as if mocking them. Despite the frustration, they kept shooting. The noise echoed across the plains, startling sheep and kangaroos, waking nearby farmers who watched the scene unfold from porches with their morning tea, heads shaking in disbelief. By mid-morning, the battle had ended. Roughly a dozen birds were confirmed dead. The rest, more than 1,000, had simply vanished back into the brush. By this point, morale within the unit had begun to fray. Some soldiers joked bitterly about how they had enlisted to fight men, not monsters with feathers. Others sat quietly, cleaning rifles that seemed to do little good, staring out across golden fields now marked by craters and trampled crops. But in the evening, around the fire, they tried to find normalcy. Dinner was tinned beef and damp biscuits washed down with warm tea. A few of the younger privates attempted songs with harmonicas, while others swapped exaggerated stories of the day's battle, about emus dodging bullets mid-stride or staring down rifle barrels without flinching. Laughter came, hesitant at first, then rolling, raw and relieved. Humor was their last defense. Major Meredith, meanwhile, studied maps by lantern light. His boots were caked in dried mud, his coat smelling of smoke and metal. He circled areas of recent sightings and noted where ammunition had been wasted. The numbers told a grim story. They were firing hundreds of rounds for every bird felled. It was not sustainable, and still the emus pressed on. Fields were torn up nightly, fences flattened, silos pecked open. Even the sheep were disturbed by the flocks, refusing to graze near their trails. Farmers pleaded for stronger action, sending telegrams and letters to the ministry, some even demanding aerial bombardments. One newspaper ran a cartoon depicting a soldier waving a white flag at an emu wearing a general's helmet. Back in Perth, officials were growing uneasy. The operation, initially approved with little fanfare, was becoming a public relations nightmare. The emus weren't just a nuisance now, they were becoming a national joke. Editorials accused the army of incompetence. One article posed the question no one wanted to hear: what if we're losing? Meanwhile, in the outback, the birds continued their silent campaign. Reports came in from farther west, near Walgullen and Narrabeen. Emus in greater numbers moving steadily inland. It was as if, emboldened by their victories, they were expanding their territory. One old farmer claimed he'd seen over 2,000 birds in a single day. Another swore they'd nested in his hay barn. And as strange as it may seem, patterns were beginning to emerge. The emus favored areas with standing water, moved in the early morning and late afternoon, and used cover intelligently. When pursued, they split into smaller pods, weaving through thickets and tree groves where no vehicle could follow. This knowledge didn't help much. The soldiers still lacked speed, firepower, and reliable equipment. Ammunition was running low, and every time they seemed close to gaining ground, the emus vanished like shadows. But what no one expected, not the soldiers, nor the farmers, nor the bureaucrats in Canberra, was what came next. Because by the end of the week, the emus began to fight back. Not with weapons, not in the way humans understood battle, but through sheer, unshakable persistence. A group of birds raided a field in broad daylight, ignoring warning shots. Another squadron stomped a newly built fence line into the dirt. One bird reportedly chased a soldier for half a mile, flapping wildly, refusing to be scared off. It was no longer a matter of simple defense. The emus had declared open defiance. And somewhere out in the bush, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, and the wheat swayed like golden sea waves, a shape moved silently through the brush. A particularly large emu with a ragged crest and a limp from an old bullet wound. The soldiers had taken to calling it the Marshal. They whispered about it at night, half in jest, half in reverence. It had survived 6 encounters, and it always returned. As the birds regrouped and the soldiers tried to sleep with one eye open, it was clear the war was far from over, and the emus were just getting started. As the days of November wore on, the heat crept upward with an oppressive stillness that made the plains shimmer like glass, while the scent of dust and dried grass became part of the air itself. Captain Meredith, sweating beneath the stiff wool of his uniform, stared out across the horizon and wiped a grimy sleeve across his brow. His men were growing restless again. Not from fear, the emus were no threat in the traditional sense, but from frustration, from the sheer absurdity of it all. They had driven over 100 miles in the past few days, chasing flocks that disappeared as fast as they appeared, as if the emus had some kind of uncanny sense for the army's approach. Private Jones swore they could hear the trucks coming from miles off, and that they laughed, actually laughed, in their low, rumbling bird way before scattering into the grass. Nobody contradicted him. At night, the men cooked over smoky campfires, eating hard biscuits, tinned meat, and whatever kangaroo or rabbit they could shoot on the way. The birds they hunted, ironically, remained untouchable. They sang old marching songs with altered lyrics that mocked the enemy. 10-foot birds with heads of brass, outsmarting men with guns and gas, and tried to keep their spirits up. Yet, underneath it all, the embarrassment was palpable. This wasn't a war anyone could take pride in. Back in Campion and the surrounding towns, the farmers waited anxiously for news. Every evening, over whiskey or weak tea, they gathered at local pubs and front porches, debating whether the military had made any difference at all. Fences were still trampled, wheat still ruined, and the sound of birds still echoed across the fields like the drumming of distant artillery. But it was during one dawn patrol near the small settlement of Walgullen that things truly began to shift. The unit had tracked a particularly large flock to the edge of a salt lake, a wide, sun-blasted basin where the birds appeared momentarily cornered. Meredith gave the order to encircle the flock, attempting a pincer movement with the trucks. The soldiers leapt down, setting up their Lewis guns, their boots crunching in the brittle salt crust as they took position. And then, as if by some invisible signal, the emus surged, not away from the guns, but through them. Not aimless panic this time. It was a coordinated charge. Wings flapped violently, beaks snapped, and claws lashed out. One bird knocked a machine gun off its tripod. Another ran straight into a soldier, knocking him onto his back before disappearing into the haze. The guns opened fire, but the recoil was difficult to control on the uneven ground. Meredith shouted orders, but most of the soldiers were either ducking or laughing. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. When the dust cleared, a dozen birds lay motionless on the cracked salt, but hundreds had escaped. One soldier, face down in the dirt with a bruised rib and a mouthful of gravel, muttered, "They're not running anymore. They're fighting." Word of the event traveled fast. Not through official reports, of course, the army still had its pride, but through whispers, letters, and the amused columns of country newspapers. Farmers began referring to the birds as organized and coordinated. Some even joked about a possible emu general, a feathered Napoleon directing maneuvers from the tall grass. At headquarters, military officials debated the incident behind closed doors. Some wanted to withdraw entirely, declare the experiment a failure, and let the embarrassment quietly fade. But others, unwilling to concede defeat to flightless birds, insisted on doubling down. More ammunition was requested. The trucks were repaired and refueled. A new strategy was to be developed. Meanwhile, the emus, untaught, unschooled, and utterly wild, simply kept doing what they had always done. They roamed in flocks, vast and silent, migrating with the wind. Only now, perhaps, they had learned something too. Something about the way the soldiers moved, the direction the trucks came from, the noise of the weapons. And in their own strange way, they were adapting. And so, under the blazing Australian sun, what had started as a brief campaign became something else. Something drawn out, confused, and vaguely tragic. A war not of glory, but of grit and stubbornness. A war that defied logic. A war that refused to end. The sun rose over the wheat fields of Western Australia with a deceptive calm, its golden rays painting the plains in warm hues, as though nature had no idea of the chaos brewing just beneath the surface. But the soldiers knew better. By now, there was a rhythm to the days. Wake up to the rustle of canvas tents flapping in the wind, sip black tea brewed over a sputtering campfire, and gear up for what had become an unrelenting, exhausting chase. Their hands smelled permanently of gun oil and canvas. The dirt beneath their fingernails was no longer worth scrubbing out. The war against the emus was not going away. It was evolving. Major Meredith had begun to receive handwritten notes from farmers on the outskirts of the region, scrawled in pencil and delivered by horse or tractor. "They're getting smarter," one read. Another warned, "They circle back when you leave, almost like they know when we're gone." Meredith would smooth the creased pages across his field desk, stare at the words, and feel something crawl up his spine. He wasn't sure what troubled him more, the absurdity of the war itself or the fact that these birds seemed to be learning. And the men were growing restless. Back at base, meals had turned into extended periods of quiet contemplation. Canned mutton was losing its taste. Potatoes were being rationed, and the occasional onion was a celebration. The men played cards with a grim dedication, shuffled the same battered deck until the corners frayed. In the background, the wind whispered through dry grass, and now and then, a single emu would be spotted near the perimeter. Never close enough to shoot, always just enough to remind them. The enemy is watching. One afternoon, the battalion attempted a full sweep of a valley where hundreds of emus had reportedly been spotted 3 days prior. Trucks were fueled, Lewis guns mounted, and men loaded up with belts of ammunition slung across their shoulders like grim sashes. Dust clouds rose as engines roared to life. For a brief moment it felt like real war, until it didn't. As they approached the valley, a thick haze hung in the air, kicked up by the very birds they were pursuing. The emus had scattered, again. But not randomly. They split into smaller units, sprinting with uncanny coordination. Some ducked behind tree clusters, others led the trucks into terrain too soft for heavy wheels. When the Lewis guns opened fire, the birds were already vanishing, their legs a blur of motion, zigzagging in maddening unpredictability. Gun barrels overheated, ammunition belts jammed. The men cursed, some laughed out of sheer disbelief. One soldier reportedly fired 40 rounds into a flock, hitting nothing but dust and disappointment. "They're ghosts," he muttered as he kicked at the dirt. Fast, quiet, and impossible. At night, fires burned lower. There were fewer songs now, and laughter had grown rare. A kind of silence began to form. A heavy one, not born of fear, but confusion. How had it come to this? Seasoned men of the military, crawling through farmland, outmaneuvered at every turn by what were essentially oversized chickens. It would have been funny if it weren't real. The war was making headlines back in Perth. The newspapers ran titles like "Emus Holding Ground" and "Farmers Demand Reinforcements." Editorials argued whether the army should even be involved. A cartoon depicted a platoon surrendering to an emu holding a white flag. The humor didn't sit well with the men in the field. Back in camp, plans were drawn on unfolded maps, the edges weighted down with empty mugs and biscuit tins. Meredith's brow furrowed more each day. If they couldn't win through brute force, maybe they needed something else. Something clever. Something the emus didn't expect. It was then that Private Harold Jenkins suggested something unorthodox, using decoys. Stuffed emus, perhaps, or even painted shapes. At first, the idea was laughed off, but within the hour, they were tying bundles of hay together, shaping them crudely, and dressing them in feathers collected from previous kills. These dummies were placed in open fields, baited with water troughs and grain, watched carefully from the hills. And then, they came. Just before dawn, the first real success in days. A group of 6 emus cautiously approached one of the decoys, poking at it with suspicion, heads bobbing. The soldiers held their breath, fingers on triggers. Meredith gave the signal. This time, the burst of gunfire found its mark. 3 birds down. The rest fled, but not before one more was clipped by a second volley. It wasn't much, but it was something. The mood shifted. The men ate that night with renewed energy, even if it was still the same stew of onions and questionable meat. They told stories again. Someone carved a tiny emu from a scrap of wood. Another started humming a song, something about birds and bullets. But just when it seemed that fortune might turn, something happened that no one anticipated. Near one of the dummy emus, a small group of real emus began circling, not with curiosity but aggression. They pecked it, kicked it apart, scattered its hay guts across the dirt. One even knocked over the trough, spilling the grain in what felt like a statement. The message was clear. The emus were adapting again, and the war was far from over. A single emu could reach speeds up to 50 kilometers per hour, with legs built like coiled steel springs. Their feet, equipped with razor-sharp claws, were not just tools for running but weapons of defense. The Australian soldiers, though trained in warfare, had never faced anything quite like these swift, unpredictable adversaries. And in the plains near Walgulin, the challenge was becoming more psychological than tactical. It was now early December. The oppressive sun bore down on the outback like a molten lid, transforming the dirt tracks into shimmering mirages and baking the soldiers inside their uniforms. Each day began before dawn, with the sound of kettles clinking against mess kits, and the heavy boots of soldiers dragging toward the morning roll call. Despite the conditions, the men maintained a strict regimen. Discipline was one of the few things they still controlled. Their meals were modest but hearty: corned beef tins, damper bread cooked in iron pots buried under ash, and the occasional stew if rabbits were caught. The nights were worse. Mosquitoes buzzed endlessly, and the strange nocturnal cries of the bush echoed like taunts from the wild. Many soldiers lay awake, sweat pooling under their backs, their rifles resting beside them like uneasy companions. In the thick of the dust and heat, Major Meredith continued to adjust strategies. He ordered the men to split into two mobile squads. One would operate around the waterholes, where emus were known to gather at dusk. The other would track movement along the farm's edges, hoping to intercept migrating mobs before they entered crop fields. But the emus were unpredictable. Some days they would vanish entirely. No tracks, no feathers, no sounds, leaving the soldiers scanning the horizon for nothing but wind-blown trees. Other days, dozens of them would erupt from behind a scrub line, sprinting in disorganized clusters, changing direction on a whim, confusing even the best marksmen. Their leader, nicknamed the General by the troops, was a particularly massive bird with a shredded left wing and a trail of battle scars. Rumors whispered that he could outsmart traps, leap fences, and even lure the soldiers into ambushes. It wasn't true, of course. But in the war-weary minds of the men, he became a myth, a feathered ghost. The Lewis guns, despite their superior rate of fire, jammed frequently in the dust. The emus, it seemed, had a sixth sense for when a gun would malfunction. As if by cosmic joke, the birds would sprint by just as a soldier pounded the side of his weapon in frustration, cursing the sand that had clogged its mechanism. Ammunition, once abundant, was starting to run low. The desert devoured it. Then, a new plan. Engineers brought in trucks fitted with mounted guns, hoping the increased speed would allow soldiers to flank and corral the emus more efficiently. But in practice, it was a disaster. The trucks bounced wildly over the uneven ground, making it impossible to aim. In one infamous incident, a soldier nearly shot his own driver after hitting a pothole mid-burst. The emus, naturally, escaped unscathed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here they were, soldiers of the British Empire, veterans of trench warfare, bested by birds. Not even angry birds, just wild, curious, and hungry creatures doing what came naturally. It was a war where the enemy had no battle plan, no borders, no fear. And still, the damage to the farms continued. Fences were trampled, grain silos emptied. At night, by the glow of oil lamps, local farmers tallied their losses with grim faces, chewing their tobacco slowly and spitting into the dirt. At least in the Great War, one muttered, you could reason with a man. The morale of the soldiers shifted between frustration and bizarre camaraderie. Jokes formed around campfires about medals for valor against avian enemies. They imagined statues, a soldier with a gun in one hand and an emu underfoot. The laughter, though dry and tired, was a glue that held them together. But as days wore on, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a short campaign. The birds weren't just visitors. They had claimed the land in their own way, running across fences, ignoring signs, treating rifle cracks like thunder in the distance. And there was talk, quiet but persistent, that perhaps the military wasn't going to win this one. Not completely. Perhaps nature had carved out a small victory of its own. Yet the orders from above still stood. Continue the operation. Protect the wheat. Win if possible. But how do you win against an enemy that doesn't even know it's in a war? That question hung in the air as thickly as the dust, as the sun sank again over the horizon, painting the sky a blood-orange hue. And somewhere in the distance, the general watched, waiting, preparing for the next round as the sun rose over the wheat fields of Western Australia, shimmering like gold beneath the pale morning sky. The distant rumble of engines signaled yet another attempt by the military to regain control. The Emu War, no longer a mere oddity, had taken on a rhythm of desperate maneuvers and increasingly bizarre counterattacks. The people on the farms were no longer amused. The soldiers were no longer confident. The emus, however, remained ever-present, silent shadows darting through the landscape like ghosts, impossible to predict, immune to fear, and seemingly invincible. Major Meredith, hardened by days of embarrassment and dust, adjusted his helmet as he leaned against the side of the truck that carried their Lewis guns. The constant jamming of the weapons, the mobility of the emus, and the haunting emptiness after every skirmish had worn down the morale of his small unit. The days of thinking this would be over in a week were long gone. They were now in it completely, and with no clear sign of victory. That morning over breakfast, a monotonous blend of cold beans, bread hardened by the desert air, and tin cup coffee that tasted vaguely of rust. The men exchanged tired glances. Private McGinty swore he saw an emu watching him all night from the fence line. Sergeant Connor found feathers in his boots again, though no one had seen a bird enter camp. Some believed the emus were not just animals but a force of nature with a plan. Some began joking that the emus had a general of their own. By mid-morning, they received another tip from local farmers near Walgullen. A cluster of several hundred emus was gathering near the far edge of a dry lakebed. The area, wide and flat, seemed perfect for an ambush. Meredith, wiping sweat from his brow, knew this could be their chance to change the tide. The trucks rolled across the dry ground, the vibrations rattling the metal frames as dust clouds rose behind them. Soldiers clutched their weapons, eyes sharp. They had modified the trucks slightly, now allowing a gunner to stand on a mounted platform with a better line of sight. This time they would be ready. The emus came into view like a surreal mirage. Hundreds of them, clustered and still, as if waiting. Then, with the screech of tires and the echo of machine gun fire, the ambush began. But what happened next defied logic. The emus, in an explosion of movement, scattered with such speed and coordination that the truck-mounted guns couldn't track them. The terrain, once thought to be an advantage, proved to be treacherous. The trucks bounced violently, making the gunners miss their shots. The Lewis gun overheated again. One truck's struck a buried rock and spun out, knocking two men off their feet. Through the chaos, feathers drifted on the wind like mocking confetti. Some emus simply ducked and weaved through the spray of bullets with uncanny grace. Others split off and vanished into the bush in perfectly timed groups. Within minutes, the battlefield was empty again, save for two injured emus limping in the distance and the wreckage of yet another failed military maneuver. The men didn't speak as they gathered what gear they could. The silence was heavy. Meredith lit a cigarette with trembling hands and looked over the horizon. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being studied. Back at camp that night, morale was lower than ever. They shared stories in quiet voices. Private Daniels recounted the time he tried to chase an emu alone and ended up waist-deep in a muddy creek. Others spoke of the eerie silence the birds left in their wake, as if they took something intangible with them. There was a rumor that the emus were now splitting into smaller tactical groups, avoiding detection, only appearing when necessary, and vanishing just as quickly. But one thing was becoming clearer. The soldiers were starting to respect the enemy. Dinner that night was a stew of questionable origin, boiled in dented pots. The men huddled close, sharing warmth and war stories that now seemed too surreal to be real. No medals would be awarded. No newspapers would call this heroic. And yet, every man knew they were fighting a war like no other. And as they lay down to sleep, eyes scanning the darkness, some swore they heard soft rustling just beyond the tents. Not wind, not possums. Something taller, watching and waiting. The wind howled across the scrublands like a forgotten whisper, curling between the worn boots of Major Meredith's soldiers. Dust clung to every surface, mixing with sweat and turning their uniforms stiff with grime. Days had bled into each other like oil spreading across parchment, and though each man still shouldered his rifle with habitual purpose, the spark of belief had long since faded from their eyes. Each trigger pull now came more from stubborn ritual than confidence. At a hastily constructed outpost near Walgullen, the unit had established yet another ambush zone, a flat, open stretch flanked by water troughs, with saltbush lining the edges. Local farmers had promised this was where the emus came in the evening, chasing after the coolness and moisture. Meredith had grown wary of such promises, having learned they were often born of optimism rather than certainty, but he had little else to act upon. Hope, even in fragments, was all they had. That morning had begun with quiet expectation. The men rose early, frying stale bread in a bit of old mutton grease, the air thick with the scent of fat and ash. Someone brewed tea using gum leaves and river water, and they passed the tin mugs around, too tired to complain about the bitter taste. In silence, they sat on overturned crates and ammo boxes, watching the horizon shimmer under the rising sun. their conversation reduced to murmurs and sighs. Overhead, a single wedge-tailed eagle circled lazily, indifferent to the turmoil of men below. By late afternoon, the first birds arrived, not hundreds but dozens. Still, it was enough to stir motion. The men shifted into position, weapons angled low, chins tucked to shoulders, waiting for Meredith's hand signal. The emus were larger than they remembered, standing upright, feathers bristling, their black eyes scanning the strange metal objects laid out before them. For several tense minutes, neither side moved. Then, the crack of the first rifle split the air. The emus scattered, not in panic, but with a practiced elegance, zigzagging as they always had, their movements frustratingly fluid. More shots followed, echoing through the bush in uneven succession. Some soldiers had climbed into trucks again, attempting to chase down the birds across the uneven ground, but the tires found every hidden rut, and the gunners bounced helplessly with each lurch, their aim never steady enough to hit anything. Dust plumed behind the vehicles, blinding both driver and shooter. Within moments, the flock had vanished into the scrub. They managed to kill only 9 birds that day. 9. The tally board, chalked up by the communications sergeant each evening, now read, emus, 9 army, -1 morale. It became a grim joke repeated by the men between dry chuckles and gritted teeth. The frustration was no longer silent. Corporal Hughes, usually the quiet one, finally snapped during dinner that night, slamming his spoon down into the shared pot of overcooked beans. "We're soldiers, not bird watchers," he growled, his voice tight with exhaustion. "We've wasted bullets, time, and whatever's left of our dignity chasing ghosts on legs." No one corrected him. No one laughed. They just sat, hunched over their meals, chewing as if it were their only remaining duty. Meanwhile, the farmers, observing the lack of results, began to murmur too. At town meetings in Meriden and Kellerberrin, the mood had shifted. Where once there had been applause at the arrival of the military trucks, there was now skepticism. Some suggested they could do better with their own rifles and a good hunting party. Others questioned whether this entire enterprise had ever been worth the bother. After all, the emus weren't just running, they were learning. Reports filtered in from scattered homesteads. The birds had started avoiding the known water traps. They traveled in tighter groups now, moved only at night, and even posted scouts. Individual emus that lingered at the edges of clearings, watching, then retreating if anything seemed unusual. It was madness to say, but it seemed the emus were adapting. Major Meredith, seated at his desk under a canvas tent by lamplight, flipped through the latest reports, then set his pen down with a sigh. There was no strategy that hadn't been tried. No new weaponry would arrive. Command in Perth had gone quiet, save for a single letter from a colonel up the chain, which simply read, "Continue operations until satisfactory outcome is achieved." Vague, bureaucratic, and unhelpful. He stared out into the night, watching a pair of emus dart between shadows beyond the perimeter. Just silhouettes against the moonlight, yet they looked so assured in their step, as though they belonged here and the soldiers didn't. It wasn't just a failure in tactics anymore. It was something deeper, a fundamental misunderstanding between two worlds, one shaped by regimented plans and the other ruled by instinct and survival. Still, tomorrow they would rise again. Tomorrow they would ready their weapons, oil their rifles, and follow the birds into the bush. Because quitting wasn't an option. Not yet. And so, as the stars spilled across the outback sky, the Great Emu War dragged on. Not as a battle, but as a slow, grinding testament to how stubborn both man and nature could be when neither was willing to yield. As the sun continued to scorch the Western Australian horizon, the emus began adapting in ways that startled even the most skeptical observers. The flocks, which once seemed to charge with reckless abandon, were now showing signs of tactical discipline. Reports came in from scattered patrols that birds were no longer running blindly into rifle fire. Instead, they skirted the edges of engagement, testing response times, darting through cover, and using the terrain to their advantage. It was unnerving, almost uncanny, as if the emus had learned the logic of human warfare, or perhaps more disturbingly, had never forgotten it. Inside the makeshift military tents, erected hastily near Campion and other key hotspots, the mood had shifted. The laughter that once echoed across evening mess halls, jokes about bird stew, wagers on kill counts, was beginning to die down. Men sat quietly, sipping tin mugs of tea brewed too strong, or chewing slowly on damper and salted meat, their gazes fixed on the dim orange horizon. The war wasn't supposed to last this long. It wasn't supposed to feel like a stalemate. Major Meredith, who had once spoken with firm conviction about the superiority of man and machine, now reviewed his daily reports with furrowed brows. Casualties were minimal, of course, it was still birds they were fighting, but the failure to secure decisive victories was eating away at morale. Ammunition expenditure was climbing sharply, with thousands of rounds fired for only a handful of confirmed kills. More and more, his men spoke in hushed tones about the phantom birds, flocks that vanished into wheat fields, then reappeared miles away, seemingly mocking their pursuers. At night, by the weak flickering of lanterns and the occasional crackle of the wireless, letters were written home. Some men described their days like adventures, others as embarrassments. A few, unable to articulate the strange mix of absurdity and frustration, simply wrote nothing at all. Even the local farmers, who had initially cheered the arrival of soldiers, were beginning to murmur. They had expected swift retribution, the kind of orderly efficiency that would restore peace to their lands. But as fences remained broken, as crops continued to be trampled under the relentless march of heavy emu feet, they began to lose faith. Some took to hunting the birds themselves, forming civilian patrols with rifles and dogs. But even these efforts often ended in failure. The birds were too fast, too numerous, too elusive. The sun rose in a fiery blaze above the canal zone, illuminating a landscape forever altered by ambition and labor. The thick tropical heat pressed down on men who had long since become accustomed to its relentless embrace. From the ramshackle camps nestled among towering palms to the sprawling excavation sites carved from jungle and mountain, the pulse of construction throbbed steadily, undeterred by weather or weariness. Before the day's work began, men gathered for a shared breakfast, a vital ritual that bonded the workforce. Strong coffee, rich and bitter, steamed from enamel mugs, its aroma mingling with the scent of frying plantains and salted pork. The simplicity of the meal belied its importance. Nourishment for bodies exhausted yet determined, energy for long hours beneath the sweltering sun. Conversations buzzed in a chorus of languages: English, Spanish, Caribbean patois, Italian, Chinese, reflecting the vibrant mosaic of those who called the canal zone home. The labor continued in relentless waves. Steam shovels roared as they ripped into the earth, their massive buckets biting into centuries-old rock and soil. Men wielded picks and shovels, hauling away debris, reinforcing embankments, and preparing foundations with sweat and steadfastness. The clanging of metal, the hiss of engines, and the commands shouted by foremen created a relentless soundtrack, one that underscored the enormity of the task at hand. Culebra Cut, the project's most infamous and treacherous section, demanded constant vigilance. Despite the most advanced engineering efforts, drainage tunnels, retaining walls, slope reinforcements, the threat of devastating landslides lingered like a shadow. Sudden storms could transform the slopes into cascades of mud and rock, swallowing men, machinery, and progress alike. The workers, attuned to the slightest tremor or shift, faced these dangers daily with courage born of necessity. The workforce was a tapestry of cultures. Caribbean laborers brought with them vibrant music, dance, and storytelling traditions, their voices echoing through the humid evenings. European immigrants, many fleeing poverty or conflict, offered craftsmanship and resilience, carving out new lives in a foreign land. Chinese workers, though fewer in number, provided meticulous skill and quiet determination. While social segregation was rigid, moments of solidarity blossomed in shared meals, celebrations, and camaraderie. Children born into the canal zone grew up in a world of blended cultures and languages. Schools taught lessons in multiple tongues, while churches offered places of worship and community gathering. Their laughter and play added a hopeful melody amid the industrial cacophony. By mid-December, as the heat swelled and the wheat ripened dangerously under the sun, the soldiers had started calling the emus phantoms in feathers. What once seemed like an operation rooted in control and efficiency was now burdened with an air of quiet desperation. The vastness of Western Australia's outback had turned from strategic landscape into a slow-moving trap of dust, heat shimmer, and shifting priorities. The guns rattled less often, not for lack of will, but because the birds had grown more elusive and the humans more exhausted. At the heart of this frustration was the terrain itself. The emus had an uncanny knack for vanishing into the scrublands, slipping between tufts of spinifex grass and stony gullies with a grace that seemed almost theatrical. In the mornings, as the soldiers broke their bread and sipped tea, they would exchange stories of ghostly sightings. A flash of black across the ridge, a set of three-toed tracks that led into nowhere, a flurry of feathers on the wind. Each day's operations followed a similar rhythm. Wake at dawn, eat quickly, usually damper and leftover salted meat, wash down with brackish water, then load the trucks and rifles and head out. The soldiers had long abandoned the strategy of corralling emus into tight spaces. It had failed too many times. Now, they operated more like wandering trappers, driving slowly through the open bushland, hoping for surprise encounters, reacting to whispers in the grass. Yet, even in these dry stretches of action, there was no shortage of moments to observe. In one such instance, Corporal Davies, the same who had once tried to flank a group of birds using a curved ridge as cover, spotted something peculiar at the base of a mallee tree. Nestled in the dry roots was a clutch of emu eggs, large and blue-green, like polished river stones. Around them, scattered feathers and the marks of heavy talons told a quiet story of life continuing in spite of rifles and war. When Davies returned to camp, he told the others. A silence fell. No one had seen a nest before, not this deep into the campaign. For some, it felt like finding the heart of the enemy. For others, it was a reminder that the emus didn't see this as a war. They weren't hiding because of tactics. They were living because that's what they did. As the sun lowered, painting the dirt gold and the soldiers' faces crimson, a soft wind carried the distant calls of the birds. Some had grown used to the rhythmic thump-thump of emu footsteps in the brush, recognizing it even before it became visible. Others said they could distinguish individual cries, sharp chirrups of the young, deep grunts of the older males. It had become, in an odd way, part of their soundscape, something that lived in the periphery of every conversation, every quiet moment between bullets. By now, Major Meredith had stopped recording daily body counts. The numbers no longer mattered in the way they once had. What had begun as a mission of removal had turned into a kind of endurance test, not just for the emus but for the men. Supplies ran low. Ammunition was carefully rationed. The trucks required constant attention, their engines choking on dust and overuse. Nights were long, filled with murmurs, stories, and the slow sharpening of knives. And yet, even in the weariness, something curious had begun to take hold. A sense of respect. These birds, so awkward in appearance and chaotic in movement, had earned a strange sort of honor among the troops. They were not just a nuisance now. They were adversaries. One night, while cooking a tin of beans over a crackling fire, Lieutenant Carmichael, always more reflective than the others, said something that hung heavy in the air. "You know, lads, if these birds had rifles, I reckon we'd all be gone by now." No one laughed. They just watched the stars for a long time, listening for the shuffle of feathers in the dark. While the government back in Canberra debated the proper deployment of resources, the soldiers on the ground had no such luxury. Each day began the same way, with a tin of bully beef, the metallic taste lingering no matter how much tea they brewed to wash it down, and the distant, mocking rustle of feathers in the brush. The emus were never far, though their presence often remained invisible until it was too late. The men had grown used to this eerie rhythm. Corporal Meredith had taken to sharpening his bayonet not for combat, but out of nervous habit, the slow metallic rasp breaking the still morning air. Times, it seemed like the birds were learning. No longer were they stumbling into ambushes or charging blindly. They scouted in silence, sent smaller clusters ahead, and when startled, sprinted in erratic zigzags impossible to track, let alone target. By now, the Lewis guns were worn. Dust-clogged and jam-prone, they offered little more than a false sense of confidence. In one instance, the team attempted a new tactic, camouflaging themselves with brush and waiting near a watering hole. For nearly 7 hours, they sat silent under the blazing sun. When the emus came, dozens of them, the team held their breath. The gunners opened fire only when the birds were within 40 feet. But instead of panicking, the emus scattered and regrouped in seconds, bolting in divergent directions. One bird, shot through the leg, continued to run as if nothing had happened, leaving a trail of blood across the red earth, like a taunt. By now, the Lewis guns were worn. Dust-clogged and jam-prone, they offered little more than a false sense of confidence. In one instance, the team attempted a new tactic, camouflaging themselves with brush and waiting near a watering hole. For nearly 7 hours, they sat silent under the blazing sun. When the emus came, dozens of them, the team held their breath. The gunners opened fire only when the birds were within 40 feet. But instead of panicking, the emus scattered and regrouped in seconds, bolting in divergent directions. One bird, shot through the leg, continued to run as if nothing had happened, leaving a trail of blood across the red earth, like a taunt. It was moments like these that began to wear on the men's nerves. They weren't fighting soldiers. They were fighting ghosts in feathers. Evenings were filled with tired silence, except for the hiss of the wind and the occasional grumble about headquarters. Meals were the same day in and day out. Hardtack softened in tea, or stews that tasted mostly of salt and regret. Letters home were sparse. Most of the men had stopped trying to explain the nature of the campaign. It was one thing to face an enemy with rifles, quite another to confess you were being outmaneuvered by a bird. The local farmers, meanwhile, had developed a grim sort of admiration for the emus. Despite their destruction, there was something mythic about these birds. They walked through barbed wire like ghosts, ignored scarecrows entirely, and seemed impervious to human control. Some began calling them the ghosts of Gallipoli, a nickname that spread quickly through the camps. One day, a farmer approached the soldiers with a different kind of request. He'd rigged up a contraption, a rotating scare emus device made from tin plates and scrap metal, designed to reflect the sunlight in dazzling bursts. It whirled wildly in the wind, clanking and flashing. The man asked if the army might consider using it instead of guns. The soldiers laughed at first, but after yet another fruitless ambush, they quietly tried it. For 2 days, the emus avoided that section of field. On the third day, they returned, trampled the device, and moved on as if nothing had happened. The press, never one to miss a story laced with absurdity, began reporting the events with a mixture of mockery and awe. Headlines across Australia ran with phrases like, "Emus evade elite forces," and "Feathered foes foil firepower." The public, initially skeptical, now found itself captivated. The story had taken on a life of its own, drawing curious onlookers and letters of advice from across the country. A schoolteacher from Melbourne suggested psychological warfare. A poet from Adelaide wrote a ballad praising the emu's resilience. Some even joked that the emus should be enlisted as allies. But back in the dry heart of Western Australia, the men had no time for satire. Supplies were dwindling, morale was strained, and the birds were winning. And just as the operation felt like it could collapse entirely, new orders arrived. The military, it seemed, wasn't ready to retreat. A second phase was being considered. Reinforcements, revised tactics. There was even talk of aircraft. The war, it appeared, was not over. Not by a long shot. As December settled over the red plains and wind-swept ridges of Western Australia, the sun hung lower, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The emu war had dragged on for weeks. The excitement had long since drained from the soldiers' faces, replaced by exhaustion, sunburn, and a lingering sense of absurdity that clung to everything like dust on their uniforms. But despite it all, the emus still ruled the fields, their feathers bristling in the wind like the plumes of ancient warriors. Their numbers had not dwindled. If anything, they'd grown more cunning. Major Meredith, once hopeful and proud, now sat on the edge of his tent, fingers wrapped around a chipped tin mug of tea gone cold. The canvas flap rattled gently in the breeze. Around him, the few remaining troops maintained their weapons with a kind of weary discipline, not because they believed it would help, but because the routine was all that kept them from unraveling. Rifles were polished, belts rebuckled, ammunition counted again and again. The major opened a small notebook, its pages curled from the humidity. He scribbled a few lines, not of strategy, but of supplies. Bullets were running low again, water even lower, and worst of all, morale teetered on the edge. Some men had started to question the point of the entire campaign. "We're soldiers, not poultry hunters," one had muttered over dinner, staring down at a tin of beans. No one argued. They all knew he was right. Food, once a topic of camaraderie, had become a sore subject. The cook had tried to make the meals more tolerable with what he had, adding dingo sausage to the usual tin stew, swapping hardtack with slightly fresher damper when he could manage. But even the tastiest effort couldn't disguise the monotony. One soldier said he dreamed of roast beef and lemon tart every night, only to wake up to the sound of emus screeching in the distance and the scent of boiling beans. The birds, meanwhile, had changed. They no longer ran blindly through fields in disorganized clusters. They split into smaller flocks now, 6, maybe 10 in each, and took turns distracting patrols while others feasted on wheat or destroyed fencing. It was almost coordinated. The soldiers began referring to the most prominent of these birds by names, as if it made their defeats more palatable. "There goes Captain Beady Eye," Private Langley would whisper, pointing toward the ridge where a tall emu stood sentinel, watching the encampment like a general. One dusk, as shadows stretched long across the parched soil, a particularly bold flock breached the perimeter of a nearby homestead. The soldiers gave chase, expecting the usual scatter. But instead, the emus split and regrouped, leading the men on a winding pursuit that left 2 of their jeeps mired in soft ground. By the time the troops returned, panting and empty-handed, they found their supply tent raided. Not by thieves, but by opportunistic kangaroos who had taken advantage of the chaos. It was, as Major Meredith muttered through clenched teeth, a symphony of humiliation. To make matters worse, the press back in Perth had begun to pick up the story again. Letters from home mocked the campaign. Editorials questioned the cost. A reporter even coined the term the Great Emu Debacle, which found its way onto radio broadcasts and pub chatter. Soldiers would catch bits of it during downtime, listening to portable sets with scowls or bitter laughter. "We're legends, boys," Corporal Hughes said with a grim smile. "Just not the kind we hoped for." Yet, amid the discouragement, the mission continued. Patrols were scheduled with increasing frequency, strategies redrawn. Major Meredith requested reinforcements, not of men but of new tactics. He proposed building static gun emplacements near grain depots, hoping the emu's appetite would lure them in. It was desperate, but he had to try something. That night, the men gathered around the fire. No songs, no jokes, just the crackle of flames and the occasional call of an emu echoing in the dark like a haunting war cry. Someone passed around a bottle of rum, saved for emergencies. Tonight, they agreed, counted as one. They sat in silence, sipping slowly, as the wind rustled through the nearby grass, and somewhere out there, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of flightless birds plotted their next move. Something was changing. The soldiers could feel it. The tide had not yet turned, but the war had reached a moment of tension that all could sense. The line between predator and prey, between hunter and fool, was growing dangerously thin. And in the distance, under the dim light of a waxing moon, a lone emu stood atop a hill, still as a statue, watching, waiting. Even as the command posts buzzed with new strategies and scribbled maps marked with shifting lines of emu movement, the birds themselves had entered an unexpected phase of migration. Driven by instinct, scarcity of food, or perhaps a cunning intuition none could fully comprehend, vast numbers of emus began moving inland. What had once been a contained nuisance along the wheat belt was now a widespread scattering across the interior, an unstoppable ripple of long-legged, flightless travelers pressing deeper into the heart of the country. And as they walked, they destroyed. They trampled fences with their heavy, clawed feet, split open water tanks with relentless pecking, and in many cases, seemed to march with the single-minded defiance of creatures who no longer feared the machines of man. This great inland shift wasn't just a movement, it became a spectacle. Farmers who once saw the birds as pests now watched them with a strange blend of awe and dread, unsure whether they were witnessing migration or invasion. In some rural schools, children were kept inside for fear of the massive herds, and those who ventured out found entire roads blanketed in moving feathers, a slow, rhythmic thunder of claws on dry earth. The sun beat down without mercy, casting heat shimmers across the outback and warping the silhouettes of the emus into almost mythical shapes as they advanced like creatures out of dream or nightmare. Meanwhile, military leadership tried to remain composed. They issued reports that read more like philosophical essays than orders, full of abstractions about territory, flow, and natural rhythms, as if trying to understand their opponent on some deeper strategic level. "We are not at war with a species," one commander wrote in a now-lost dispatch. "We are attempting to interpret a phenomenon." That line alone made its way across taverns and telegrams, mocked in some circles and pondered in others. The emus, unaware of their philosophical impact, simply kept walking. They didn't need reason. They had legs built for endurance, sharp vision that caught movement miles ahead, and beaks hardened by generations of survival in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. They were no longer just a nuisance. They were an ecological force that no amount of bullets could quell. In some towns, the locals began adapting in strange ways. Pub owners offered emu-free hour drink specials, a tongue-in-cheek nod to the moments of quiet between waves of feathered chaos. Children started trading emu feathers like currency, and old-timers shared stories of when they'd had a staring contest with one of the birds and lost. Entire local myths began to sprout up, like the one about the silver-eyed emu that could stare through your soul, or the trio of ghost emus that left no tracks in the dust yet were seen every morning before sunrise. And the soldiers, exhausted, sunburnt, and half-maddened from weeks in the brush, they began to change too. At first, it was subtle. Small rituals before loading weapons, whispers of good luck passed between men like prayers. But soon it grew stranger. Some refused to shoot certain birds, claiming they'd seen them before and that the emus were watching, learning. Others began etching tally marks not for kills, but for times they'd been outsmarted. Lieutenant Meredith, ever the stoic, started keeping a journal, not of battle reports, but of behavioral observations. He noted emu hierarchies, migratory hunches, feeding patterns. He theorized that the birds were avoiding large-scale attacks intentionally, learning from their skirmishes. He wrote with admiration and fatigue, recognizing that the enemy was not only persistent but, perhaps, adaptive. In this peculiar war, the lines between military campaign and naturalist expedition had blurred. The soldiers had become both combatants and chroniclers, caught in a campaign that no longer fit into any conventional framework of victory or defeat. They weren't sure what winning looked like anymore. Back in Parliament, the tide of political pressure rose. Questions flooded the chamber floor, not just about emus, but about national identity, agriculture, and the limits of technology. Debates spiraled into existential territory. Could a nation proud of its modern machinery and European order admit defeat at the hands, or claws, of birds? Evenings fell with orange skies and long shadows across fields stripped bare. The emus, always moving, didn't stop to marvel at the light. They continued, mile after mile, reshaping the map with each step. The great inland march was not the end of the conflict. Far from it. It was merely the next ripple in a strange and silent storm, one where feathers replaced flags, and the outcome remained uncertain. Yet as the days stretched into weeks, the emu campaign that had once been viewed as a brief and manageable operation began to exhibit the characteristics of a drawn-out, perplexing quagmire. On the surface, it may have appeared as nothing more than a peculiar footnote in Australia's long chronicle of rural struggles. But on the ground, the realities facing the soldiers were anything but simple or forgettable. By mid-November, the Western Australian summer had begun to tighten its grip on the land. The soil, which once bore the faint dampness of spring, had grown dry and cracked under the weight of an unforgiving sun. Dust storms swept across the open fields without warning, scratching at the eyes and skin of both men and beasts, and coating every morsel of food and equipment with a layer of coarse grit. The men stationed across the wheat belt had grown accustomed to sharing their rations with flies, whose presence was as persistent as the emus they were meant to repel. Within the camp, morale fluctuated like a barometer in a storm. Some days brought fleeting victories, perhaps a well-timed ambush near a watering hole, or a brief moment when a flock of emus found themselves hemmed in and vulnerable. On those rare occasions, the soldiers would allow themselves a smile, perhaps even a cheer, and a hearty supper to mark the day's success. Tins of bully beef were passed around like precious coins, accompanied by hard biscuits softened in black tea that had steeped far too long on a rusted fire grate. There was little to celebrate, but they found comfort in the small things. A joke retold around the campfire, a harmonica tune floating lazily on the wind, or the unexpected sight of a pair of kangaroos watching curiously from a distance. But on most days, the landscape belonged to the emus. They would appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly, as if mocking the soldiers with their speed and cunning. Attempts to herd them into a kill zone frequently ended in chaos, with birds scattering in all directions, some leaping over fences as if gravity held no sway over their massive, awkward frames. And always there were more. Flocks of dozens became flocks of hundreds, and the sound of their feet pounding the earth became a familiar rhythm, almost like the beating of war drums in reverse. Major Meredith, who had by now become a figure of both command and frustration, kept a meticulous log of the day's activities. His notebook, smudged with dust and sweat, contained not just the raw numbers, rounds fired, birds downed, distance traveled, but also a growing list of observations on the behavior of the emus. He noted their patterns of movement, their surprising ability to anticipate traps, and even what appeared to be coordinated responses among groups. One particular entry recorded his disbelief at watching a flock divert course after a single emu broke formation and signaled a warning, a behavior that defied the idea of them being mere animals reacting instinctively. Around the mess tent, conversations often drifted into speculation. Were the emus smarter than they let on? Did they have leaders? Scouts? There was, of course, no scientific basis for these musings, but in the heat of the day and the haze of exhaustion, the line between fact and fable grew thin. Some men joked about the emu general, an imagined bird with a scarred beak and a mind for battle strategy, who watched the humans from the hills and coordinated each day's resistance. It was absurd, of course, but it gave them something to laugh at when the sun refused to give mercy. And then, almost inevitably, the war took another turn. A new batch of machine guns had arrived, Lewis guns this time, slightly more reliable, slightly better suited to mobile operations. With them came a handful of additional soldiers, green to the task and unaware of what lay ahead. The plan, now revised for the fourth or fifth time, involved mounting the guns on the back of trucks for high-speed chases. It was ambitious, risky, and entirely untested. Meredith voiced his concerns to command, but with pressure mounting from both farmers and officials in Perth, the operation had to show progress. They could no longer afford the appearance of failure, not with the press already spinning tales of an impossible war. So one morning, before the sun had properly crested the horizon, 2 trucks rumbled out into the open plain. Their engines roared, stirring clouds of dust behind them, as the mounted gunners steadied their grips and scanned the fields for movement. It wasn't long before the first emus were sighted. Dozens at first, then hundreds, moving together in a chaotic but unmistakable surge across the hills. What followed was a scene that would later be described as one of the more comic episodes in the annals of military history, though those present found little to laugh about at the time. The trucks, not designed for cross-country pursuit, bounced violently over rocks and ruts, nearly throwing the gunners from their positions. Ammunition belts jammed, barrels overheated, and visibility was reduced to near zero from the dust. One truck hit a stump and spun out, sending its crew tumbling onto the ground. The birds, meanwhile, surged forward unharmed, flanking the machines with what appeared to be preternatural ease. When the soldiers limped back into camp hours later, faces coated in sweat and disappointment, it was clear to all that another strategy had failed. Still, they regrouped. They reviewed what had gone wrong. They cleaned their weapons in silence. And when supper came, rice and a few slivers of salted pork, they sat together and made toasts to the absurdity of their mission, to the tenacity of their enemy, and to the hope that tomorrow, just maybe, they would learn how to win a war against birds. As November deepened, a dry wind swept across Western Australia's wheat belt, carrying with it the scent of eucalyptus and the rustle of brittle grass. Dust clung to every surface, coating uniforms, sticking to sweating skin, embedding itself in the folds of khaki fabric and the corners of soldiers' mouths. In the distance, a thunderous drumming echoed again, not of artillery or galloping cavalry, but of hundreds of emu feet pounding the earth in synchronized rhythm. The soldiers called it the March of Feathers, and swore you could feel it in your bones before you heard it with your ears. The emus, now strangely organized and seemingly aware of their strength, had changed tactics. Instead of scattering under fire as they had at the beginning, they now moved in staggered groups, almost as if relaying information between flocks. When one group was hit, another would approach from a different angle hours later. Major Meredith, previously confident in his reports, now sat in his tent each evening scribbling into his notebook with furrowed brow, trying to chart the erratic yet strangely purposeful movements of the birds. Maps of the region were pinned up around him with lines, pins, and strings like a general tracking enemy columns in wartime. Meals among the soldiers had grown increasingly monotonous. Bully beef, damper, and lukewarm tea boiled over campfires that hissed in the wind. There was no rest, no real sleep. At night, the distant cries of emus filtered through the darkness like ghostly laughter. By day, they came in waves, feathers on the horizon, then the charge, then silence, and feathers drifting across the trampled wheat. Meredith had begun experimenting with night operations, an idea that initially stirred some hope. The plan was simple: use the moonlight to their advantage, surprise the birds while they slept or congregated in open fields. But the emus were not easily fooled. One night, as the soldiers crept forward across a low ridge, their boots muffled in the sand and their Lewis guns set and ready, a sharp cry pierced the air, and the entire field ahead exploded into motion. It was a trap. The emus had left decoys, a few birds roosting visibly, but the main flock had been hidden in the brush nearby, waiting. The soldiers had barely time to react before being engulfed in a flurry of feathers and chaos. By morning, 3 rifles had been trampled. The Lewis gun's barrel was bent beyond repair, and Private Ellis, one of the more cheerful men in the unit, had a nasty gash across his brow from an emu kick. He joked through clenched teeth that he would wear the scar with pride, but that didn't stop the quiet from settling into camp that evening. Fewer jokes, fewer songs. The harmonica, once a nightly companion to the crackling fires, remained silent in Sergeant Turner's pack. But it wasn't just the birds growing bolder. Rumors had begun filtering in from nearby farms. Farmers had spotted what they claimed were scouts, solitary emus perched on fences, staring into windows, unafraid of dogs or gunshots. One farmer swore an emu had taken a bite from his sandwich when he left it unattended on a tractor seat. Another claimed a bird had opened his gate and released his sheep, though the practicality of that was questionable. Still, the stories spread. They filled the cold evenings with a new kind of tension. Soldiers whispered about emus learning, adapting, becoming something more than birds. And as absurd as it sounded, there was no denying the evidence stacking up. They were fighting something different. By mid-month, Meredith received word from Canberra again. Supplies would be reduced. The war, they said, had become a matter of public concern. Questions were being asked in Parliament. Editorials mocked the Army's failures. Cartoons of emus wearing medals circulated in Sydney papers. Meredith was instructed to wrap up operations soon or risk further embarrassment. But how does one wrap up a war that refuses to play by rules? That afternoon, he climbed a low hill to survey the valley below. Once, that land had been rows of healthy wheat. Now it was dust, shattered stalks, and a sea of tiny prints crisscrossing every surface. At the far end, near the glimmering outline of a windmill, stood a single emu. It didn't move, didn't flee, just watched. Meredith stared back, lips pressed into a hard line. The wind tugged at his coat. The sun dipped lower. The war was far from over. As the harsh summer stretched relentlessly across the Western Australian plains, the soldiers found themselves trapped in a battle that defied logic and expectation. The emus, once mere pests in the eyes of men, had become a strategic force, unyielding, adaptive, and relentless. The initial bravado that accompanied the arrival of soldiers and machine guns gave way to a creeping weariness that settled deep into their bones. They were hunters turned hunted by creatures that could neither fly nor understand their weapons, yet somehow always seemed one step ahead. Major Meredith's log entries had become darker, his neat script occasionally marred by smudges of dust and fatigue. He described how the emus had developed new tactics, breaking into smaller groups to confuse patrols, moving silently through the cover of dawn and dusk, and even appearing to communicate warnings with rapid calls that sent entire flocks scattering just moments before the soldiers arrived. Meanwhile, the relentless heat showed no mercy. Uniforms clung damp to skin, and boots filled with dust and small stones. The rations, consisting largely of canned meat and hard biscuits, did little to soothe the constant thirst or hunger gnawing at the men. They spoke less and observed more, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement, muscles tensed for a sudden burst of speed that never came from their side, but always from the enemy's. In camp, stories and rumors circulated like wildfire. Some swore the emus were intentionally sabotaging equipment, knocking over fuel barrels or pecking through communications wires. Others whispered about a giant emu, nearly 7 feet tall, that led the flocks like a general commanding troops into battle. These tales, born from exhaustion and a strange mixture of fear and respect, spread quickly, reinforcing the almost mythical status the birds had earned. One night, as the men sat around a fire beneath a canopy of stars, the distant calls of the emus echoed eerily through the stillness. The soldiers were silent, listening to the strange symphony of sounds that had become their nightly lullaby, a chorus of clucks, whistles, and the soft pounding of countless feet. The war was no longer just a physical struggle. It had become a test of patience, endurance, and the limits of human will. Orders came down to intensify efforts, but morale was fraying. Ammunition was being conserved, men were growing restless, and some questioned the very purpose of the campaign. The media had begun to mock the effort mercilessly, dubbing it the Great Emu Debacle, while the public oscillated between amusement and bewilderment at a government fighting a war against birds. Despite it all, the emus continued their advance, trampling fields, breaking fences, and frustrating the soldiers at every turn. Their large, powerful legs and surprising speed made them nearly impossible to catch. They seemed almost invincible, nature's own guerrilla fighters, defending their home against mechanized invaders with nothing but instinct and relentless determination. As the days wore on, it became clear this was no ordinary conflict. It was a war without end, a strange and silent battle between man and beast, where victory was elusive, and the true cost was measured not in bodies or territory, but in spirit and resolve. And so, under the blazing Australian sun, the emus marched on, unyielding, undefeated, and forever etched into the annals of history as the unlikely victors of a war that no one had truly wanted to fight. As the sun set low over the scorched Australian plains, casting long, fiery shadows across the battered wheat fields, the Great Emu War came to an unceremonious end, not with fanfare, but with quiet resignation. The soldiers, weary and worn, packed up their rifles and ammunition, their boots heavy with dust and defeat. The emus, those towering, feathered adversaries, continued to roam freely, their rhythmic footfalls a testament to endurance and wild resilience. The government withdrew military support, choosing to leave the birds to their natural dominion. Farmers returned to their fields, many armed with shotguns and traps, but no longer under the illusion that machine guns would win their battle. The emus had proven themselves too swift, too adaptive, and above all, too numerous to conquer by force. Though the war was brief, lasting mere weeks, it became a legendary chapter in Australian history, a curious tale of man versus nature and the limits of human control. Newspapers and radio broadcasts joked about the defeat by birds, while the soldiers carried home stories marked by a blend of humor, humility, and disbelief. Yet beneath the surface humor lay a deeper lesson. The Great Emu War exposed the tension between expanding human industry and the wildness that resisted domestication. It reminded a nation that some battles, no matter how earnest, are fought not just with weapons, but with respect for the natural world's unpredictable power. Today, the emus continue to stride across the outback, symbols of freedom, stubbornness, and survival. And the story of the Great Emu War endures, whispered under starry skies and retold by generations. A peculiar yet poignant reminder that sometimes, the fiercest warriors come with feathers, not guns.